Hello friends, welcome back again. In today's video, we'll talk about gender and sex. And if you are new to this channel, my name is Lingcholi Sangtam and I bring an educational videos related to our well-being. And so if you find my videos helpful, then please consider subscribing and you can share it with your friends as well. Alright, so today's video is going to be quite different from those of other videos that I brought. And I purposely chose to talk about gender and sex, knowing that this topic is quite controversial and would lead to misunderstanding if not careful. But I chose to talk about this because I found it necessary to speak about it and before I just start up, I just want to make sure that when I talk about gender and sex, I'm nowhere here trying to um, talk like somebody who is an expert on this ground, on this topic, but rather as a person who has a freedom and who has a right to express an opinion, right to raise a voice on what I think about it. And I'm especially making this video for my Naga brothers and sisters, just to make sure that we are aware of what we are talking about and we are aware of what's coming ahead of us. And so more like an awareness that I want to throw here. So let's start up with what is gender and sex. A lot of time, one mistake that people commit is we are unable to differentiate between gender and sex. So when you are using the term, what do you mean by the term that you are using makes a huge difference in understanding what you are talking about. So when we talk about gender and sex, there is a huge difference between gender and sex. So let me try to quickly simplify what is gender and what is sex. So when we talk about gender, gender refers to the socially constructed characteristics of men and women, such as norms, roles, and relationships of and between men and women, or any other gender we can add. Right, that's one. So when we talk about gender, gender is a social constructed term that we use to identify particular sex. So when we talk about women, so women is a name given to one particular sex, or men is a name given to a particular sex. Not just name that is given, but certain roles and norms that has been implied, so that there are certain, as we know, when we talk about men, there are certain roles that in society, there are certain roles that men has to do and certain roles that men are responsible of doing. And when we talk about women, there are certain roles according to the norms of the society. There are certain roles and there are certain norms that women has to follow. And so those are social constructed characteristics that we give for the two different sex. And today, society have recognized more than two gender, and so on comes in. Now, sex. When we talk about sex, sex is very much different from what we are talking about gender. So when we talk about sex, sex refers to the different biological and physiological characteristics of males and females, such as reproductive organs, chromosomes, hormones, etc. So when we talk about sex, sex is not identified or sex is not differentiated with social norms or social identities that we give to a certain gender. But when we talk about sex, how do we identify what sex a person is? Then, to identify a sex, it is determined by the biological and physiological characteristics of male and female. Or if we have to put more than that, then we can put so. But here, when we are talking about sex, what determines sex is the biological and physiological characteristics of a particular person. So as we know now, there is a huge difference between gender and sex. So when we talk about gender, gender is basically a socially constructed terms that is being used to identify certain sex. So let's say if women, and then it comes along with certain norms and roles implied towards the particular sex. So that is about gender. When we talk about sex, sex is basically determined by the biological and physiological characteristics of a person, such as reproductive system, chromosomes, hormones, etc. So that is basically about sex. So when we talk about gender, it depends upon how society identifies you as. So how you are nurtured. So it hugely depends on the environment that you are in and from the society that you are in. But when we talk about identifying sex, then it fully depends on your biological nature, your biological features, your physiological characteristics. We know by the reproductive organs, we know by chromosomes, we know by hormones, and so on. And so that's the basic way to identify on what sex is. Now, I want to bring some of my arguments on why there can be only two sexes biologically and why I find it not necessary to have more than two genders. So, here are some of the reasons why. First of all, what does biology says about sex identity? So when we talk about sex identity according to biology, then we start from the very beginning, from the stage of fertilization, or in other words, we call it as conception. So it is simply the process of sperm and ovum, that is, in other words, male and female gametes, sex cells. So when they combine to create a new single cell called zygote. So zygote, in other words, is undeveloped human being. So let's put it that way. So when we talk about identifying sex, then we cannot avoid talking about chromosomes. So new life is formed with 23 paired chromosomes, as we know. And the 22 paired chromosomes are responsible for everything apart from determining sex. So the only chromosomes responsible for determining sex is the 23rd paired chromosomes. So we know that normally when we talk about sex, it comes along with XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes. And when it is XX chromosomes, then it turns out to be female. Then when it is XY chromosomes, then it turns out to be male. So that is a very simple so there's a very simple lesson that we have learned from high school science textbook. So that's how sex is determined by the third chromosomes, which is also the sex chromosomes. But not necessarily every single time it has to be XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes. Sometimes it turns out to be beyond XX and XY. That is, sometimes it turns out to be XXS, sometimes it turns out to be XO, and so on, a lot more. How do we address that? So that's the thing. So here's a table you can screenshot and you can look upon it on what this table shows. Now, beyond XX and XY chromosomes, sex chromosomes, are caused due to some genetics miscoding. And when we talk about genetics miscoding, when there is a genetics miscoding on the process, then it will lead to chromosomal abnormalities. So, what is beyond XX and XY? So, if there is sex chromosomes more than XX and XY, it is not necessarily a chance for somebody to say that there is a possibility of having more than two sex. It's not. But what we address that is in developmental view, in human developmental view, what do we address that is we consider that to be a chromosomal abnormalities. So certain abnormalities can happen beyond XX and XY sex chromosomes if it turn out to be. So it can lead to certain abnormalities in the person. So since there is beyond XX and XY chromosomes, it does not mean there has to be more than two sexes. So that is what is to be cleared. Secondly, in identifying sex depends hugely on the hormonal influence. So it's interesting that there was a study done in 2010 by Kishimada and Koopmans. So in their study, an experiment was done in mouse. So this is what they did. So in Kishmada and Koopman's study, they found that without a male hormonal influence, in other words, for human beings, we have male hormone, that is testosterone. So our maleness also depends on the testosterone level. So which is a very important hormone, by the way. So here in their study, they found that without a male hormonal influence, a genetically male mouse will develop genitals that appear female rather than male. So it's interesting that this study shows that without a male hormonal influence, genetically male mouse will develop genital that appears female rather than male. So the one thing that we can be identified on which sex we are is our genitalia, our sex organs. So here, without a particular hormones for particular sex, there can be changes in the structure, and there can be changes even in our genitalia, even in our organs, sex organs. And then the study does not just end there, and then it comes up with the statement that it is likely that a similar mechanism occurs in human male. So that is the same thing for male. And so when one does not have a particular sex hormone, then certain things changes can occur. That is one. So this is what biology says about how sex can be identified or how particular sex are formed. So here, to me, it shows that because here, as far as I've studied, there can be certain abnormalities that can occur in human person or human body because that is completely natural, and that doesn't make somebody less human than the other, right? But it's just that there are certain abnormalities that is happening. But those abnormalities and all other genetics miscoding and does not necessarily mean that there is a possibility of having more than two sex. So that is what biology shows, by the way. And so if this is not right, then the entire thing that we have been studying right from the very beginning of our schoolings, and then the textbook that we have read about basic biology, about the formation of human life, all these uh, are wrong. And so either biology is wrong, the textbooks that we have read is wrong, or something must be wrong. And so I don't bring any conclusion here. So there is one argument from the ground of biology. The next thing is what the psychology says about sex or about gender. So psychologically, there is always environment is one huge thing, and then of course we also look biologically. But as we talk about how what biology says about sex, then what about environment? Right. Nature is one thing and nurturing is one thing. So how you are nurtured is one thing. What environment that you are in is one thing. So when we talk about sex, then environmental influence is also one huge thing. Today, especially we Nagas, we are so much influenced by Western societies, and I mean like we are so much influenced by other culture, vastly Western culture, and so even the way we dress, the way we speak, the way we do things, like so much influenced by other culture, and therefore when that's a thing when that's a thing, there is no way of particularizing gender without including environment. And so we cannot measure gender or we cannot measure our gender identity excluding environmental influence, and therefore environmental influence always comes in. And so how we are, the way you talk, the way you hold something, the way you walk, the way everything depends on the environmental influence, and so that has a lot to do. And when we look on developmental psychology, there are certain stages that goes through certain different things. Vastly, I want to focus on adolescence. That's what they call it as adolescence, the stage. Roughly, let me roughly put it as let's say 12 years to let's say 20 or 21 years, because the age group differs from culture to culture, and also it differs from individual to individual, and so I cannot particularly put certain age group. So let me roughly put it as 11 to 20 or 21. So between this stage adolescence, let's say adolescence is a stage when there are huge changes that takes place. So in adolescence, physiological changes, huge physiological changes occurs. Also, there are hormonal changes that occurs, and so for female we can know by having let's say monthly periods, right? Menstrual cycle. So women go through that, and then on male flocks we see developing let's say sex cell, that is sperms, developing sperms. There are certain physiological changes that happens, and as we know, a huge development that also occurs in sex organs, both primary sex organs and secondary sex organs. So a lot of changes that occurs in this stage, and also a lot of studies, psychologists warns that, researchers also warn that, and then also says that this stage is a very confusing stage, right? And there are lots of confusion that happens in this stage, and so they also fight for identity. I mean, like lots of confusion that happens, lots of struggles that takes place in this stage, and so I always consider this stage as one of the very important stage in all human stages of life. So when all these things happens, it is possible that one will be very much confused of everything, and so what's the developmental psychologist wants that this is also a stage when gender confusion can also occur if not careful and if not properly guided. So I mean, this is when you are potential of making choice for yourself, right? One can make decision for self, one can choose what's best for oneself and what's pleasing for oneself. And so that's the thing, because at the end of the day, as a human beings, rational and emotional beings, we are responsible of what we are doing. We are responsible of our life. We are responsible of our decision making. So who you are depends on what you learn and what you choose to be. So at the end of the day, right from the childhood, right from your infant stage and to whatever stage, what you learn is one thing, and with what you learn, what you choose to be is other thing. So who you are depends on what you learn and what you choose to be. So that is one very important thing, from when we try to view psychologically on sex and gender identity. So next thing, I want to look biblically. Now, what does Bible says about gender or sex? When we look into the Bible talks about heterosexuality. So, especially when it comes to marriage, marriage in the Bible is purely heterosexual, not homosexual, and it is God oriented. Why God talks about marriage and then heterosexuality? Because that is God's oriented. We can look right from the Genesis chapter 1 when God created human beings in His own image, in His likeness. There was a time Adam was alone, and so God found that it's not good for men to be alone, and therefore he has to accompanied by somebody. And so God created woman, right? And so Adam and Eve. And then what God says is to multiply, right? Multiply life. And so what is the way to multiply? So to multiply, in other words, to create a new life is possible only in the domain system of heterosexuality. So homosexuality, there is no possibility to create new life, and so that's one thing. The other thing is when we look into the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 22, and 20, verse 13, and so on, we'll see that God surely, clearly mentions that homosexual is abomination to God, right? Men lying with men is abomination. Women lying with the same sex is abomination to God. It's like disrespectful to God. So why it is disrespectful? Because something that is original, something that is the way God made it to be, when we goes against that, it becomes something very artificial. So God's uh, purpose here in making human life is the way we should be. So it's so much focused on the authenticity, the way we are made to be. So when we create something else that goes against the authenticity of God's creation, then that is something that goes against God. And so, this is homosexual is considered abomination to God. Next thing we see on Apostle Paul says that homosexual is contrary to God's natural order and results from rejecting God. So Romans that we'll see in Romans 1 verse 26 and 27 we'll see, because here rejecting God, homosexuality can be an outcome of rejecting God. So that is one thing as a result, right? And then we look in Jude 1 verse 17. There it refers, it used the Sodom and Gomorrah story is a reference, right? It is a reference that people were indulged in sexual immoralities and pursued unnatural desire. And so, why that story has been mentioned as an example or is a figure to make us understand that it is something unnatural. It's something unnatural desire. Heterosexuality is something natural desire. Homosexuality is biblically, it shows that it is an unnatural desire. It's a pursuit of unnatural desire. And therefore, what is the good outcome of homosexuality and what is the good outcome of heterosexuality? There is a vast difference between homosexuality and heterosexuality. And therefore, that's what Bible have to say about sex, right? So which do you prefer? It's upon human. It's upon you and I. But that's what Bible says about um, today in this world, in different part of the world, there are churches that allows same-sex marriage, and everything. Crazy things are going on. But when they are doing that, the the scary thing is, how can we be doing all this? How can we be the one Bible mentions about the wrong teachings, the wrong teachers, the evildoers, right? The evildoers. And why should we be the one? And when we are doing all this, like everybody has a freedom to do so, why not? But why should we do something that Bible has been warning, the Word of God has been warning from a centuries and centuries back? Why should we be the one, like the evildoers, right? And so, why should we be the one going against God? We as a creation, we as a creator, His creator, and God as a creator. So that's other thing. So cultural threat, especially I'm here talking as a Naga. So like I've asked to multiple people, like to my seniors, elders in village, elders of, like my mentors and a lot of like good people around me. Like culturally, did we had any kind of homosexual understanding in our culture? Then our culture never had that, as far as I know and as far as I've learned. Because when the threat is that, because I've heard lots of rumors that is happening even in Nagaland, and then I hope and believe that all the rumors are wrong, but I think that it is happening. And so it is also, I consider it as a cultural threat, because this is your culture, and when you try to adopt something that goes against your culture, it's a cultural threat, right? It's a threat to your culture. And so what I want to bring here is that, I mean, Nagas have never before had gender confusion, and culturally, we never had this. And so, what terrifies the most, and what's terrifying is our parents' generation, my parents' generation, they had never had the issue. They never saw this coming. They never saw this culture coming. And most people today consider homosexual is also kind of a trend that is happening, right? People are enjoying what they are doing. And so, my parents' generation, our parents' generation, Nagas have never saw this coming. But now our generation, we are seeing it coming, and some people are already accepting that this is okay, right? The next thing, what's even more terrifying, is that we are seeing it coming, but our next generation, our children, will face another different thing. That is, it will already be here, right? This trend will already be here. So when they grow up, it'll be a normal thing for them. Everything will become normalized. So it will no longer be because they never saw it coming. So it will be a normal thing for them. So that is very much dangerous, and that is very much harmful to our culture, to our society, and therefore to be very much aware of what we are doing, to be very much aware of what we are speaking about, to be very much aware of what we are seeing around us. So that is one thing. And here I'm not at all trying to go against, something, the different genders that is coming up. I'm nowhere. I'm not interested even. But what interests me, and in fact, what also terrifies me, is that if ever our culture can be lost, if ever we as a Christian we go against what Bible says, and if ever we don't understand what biology says about sex, and so on. So that is a very terrifying thing. And so I just want to end my video here. And if you find this video helpful, then please consider subscribing and consider sharing it with your friends now who you think that they are they need to listen to this video. So that is a very basic and simple information, and let's say um, thoughts that I wanted to share on sex and gender. And if you think that there are more things that I have to talk about it, maybe I can have maybe deeper study on this particular thing, that is sex and gender, and maybe I can make more video. But as for today, this will be the end of the video. Thank you. See you in the next video.